Daily news and analysis. We keep you informed and inspired.
This is World Today.
Hello and welcome to the panel discussion of World Today. I'm Ding Heng in Beijing. The disruption around the Strait of Hormuz has posed a great threat to global energy security. The crisis is once again drawing our attention to renewable energy, something that is already operating at scale. According to energy think tank Ember's research, solar power growth in 2025 alone could displace gas-fired electricity equal to all liquefied natural gas exported through the Strait of Hormuz in the same year. In this edition of the program, we will explore whether the Hormuz crisis is accelerating global transition to renewable energy. To listen to this episode again or to catch up on previous episodes, you can download our podcast by searching World Today. So joining us now on the line are Professor Steven Wright, Director of the Leadership Knowledgebase at the Qatar Leadership Centre, Professor Laury Haytayan, Middle East and North Africa Director with Natural Resource Governance Institute, as well as Dr. Christis Tombazos, Associate Professor of Economics at Monash University. So, thank you very much for joining us, dear panelists. Professor Wright, to start with you, the Strait of Hormuz crisis is by no means the first energy supply disruption we see. There have been the oil crisis of the 1970s, the Iran-Iraq war of the 1980s, Iraq's invasion of Kuwait in 1990, etc. Did any of those past crises come close to the magnitude of the current disruption?
Yeah, well, thank you very much for the question. My view is I don't think any of those previous historical crises really come close to what we're currently facing. Those were oil crises that previously happened, but I think what's happening now, we have to kind of understand it as something much broader than an oil crisis. This is something which is affecting a wider range of commodities. If we were to look at the, what's happened currently, the International Energy Association Agency basically has said that this is the largest supply disruption historically. It's affected the supply chains of more than 20 million barrels a day equivalent. The choke point of the Strait of Hormuz basically has resulted in all of the exports basically grinding to a halt from the region, with only a trickle coming through. But of course now with the latest extra layer of a blockade coming from the United States, this has really ground it to a halt completely. I think when you look at historically, though, in terms of sizes, if you compare it to, say, 1973, the oil crisis back then, and also the period during the after the Iranian Revolution and during the Iran-Iraq War, the scale in terms of of oil that was disrupted is significantly smaller. I mean, it was about 9.6 million barrels in the 1980s, and it's around about 2.5 times what it was in 1973, which is just under 4 million barrels a day. But I think what's important here is that the shock that we're currently facing is much more rapid than what previous shocks have been. This has happened over a case of 2 weeks, 2-3 weeks that we've seen the disruption take place, whereby we've even seen energy infrastructure being hit and knocked out of action. We've seen this in the case of Qatar, where it's extended to LNG and its facilities there, which could take up to 5 years to rebuild. And also it's affected a wide range of commodities, as I mentioned earlier. So it's affected petrochemicals, LNG, sulfur, urea, aluminium, ammonia. All of these are affecting a number of key sectors of the global economy. And this is why I think the current crisis is much more deeper and much more significant than in previous shocks. And I'll just add one final thing. I think the reason why energy prices have not reached highs of just under $200 a barrel, or maybe 170 dollars a barrel plus, is really because of the strategic petroleum reserves being gradually put onto the market. But I think if this continues for the foreseeable future, we would see prices rise even more.
So, Laury, going to you, the UN says the Hormuz shock underscores a fundamental issue that energy security is no longer just about supply, but also about resilience and finding alternative power sources in an increasingly unstable world. In other words, I guess for decades, energy security has largely been defined by reserves and production capacity, etc., those issues. But the Hormuz shock is exposing a different vulnerability, namely our ability to move energy sources to where it's really needed. So, do you think transition to renewable energy, as some people are suggesting, represents a possible solution to this vulnerability?
So thank you for having me on the show. And to say that definitely the transition is part of the story. Basically, as you said, for years, the energy supply was important and diversification of the supply was very important. People were talking about you need to have your own, yes, strategic reserves. And that's very important. And that came after the 1973 shock crisis. And then it was automatically a decision that was taken that we need to have that buffer in case there is a supply shock and disruption. And then let's have the reserves. And I guess that's part of the story, to be having the reserves and to have the other story is like the diversification of even sources. So not to rely on one supplier, that's important. And to add on it, the story is like, and yes, you need to have a diversification in the resources that you're using, and renewables are part of that story. Until now, we haven't reached a point where renewables could cover or could be the complete alternative to, for instance, in electricity production, for instance, instead of coal, 100% renewable, or instead of natural gas, 100% renewables. We haven't reached that, but renewable has started to pick up, and recently it had been pick up. And I think this crisis today reminds everyone that this is needed to continue on the path of this green transition and on renewables, because today renewable is again becoming the same as the concept of strategic reserves. It is becoming something that would prevent you from any major crisis in electricity production, at least, if we want to talk about that renewable, or to increase your electricity to use it for other for the electrification of your economy. So that's what we're seeing, and I hope like we will continue on that trajectory, because let's say for like in the past couple of years, after a strong boost for supporting countries in their strategies for their transitions, etc., there was a boost, and there were like really strong boost, and then we felt we were kind of regressing on that, being it like in the US, in Europe, and even that had created this sort of a boost even for the producing countries that were saying that, you see, it's not a transition, it's an addition. And I think today it reminds us that, yes, we need to keep on that track of increasing renewable in our energy mix, at least to prevent us from any sort of major crisis that we're seeing today, and that won't affect the population either in increasing the prices of electricity or even in switching to, for instance, what we're seeing nowadays, switching from gas to coal. And the whole purpose was to switch from coal to gas and the renewables. So that's a good reminder to keep on track for the green transition.
Dr. Tombazos, going to you. Traditionally, we know advocates of green energy sources have proclaimed their climate, their environmental or health benefits. Of course, those benefits will continue to be there and it will probably become more important in the future. But do you think there are other benefits such as price stability and domestic energy resilience will become more relevant in a turbulent world?
Thank you for this excellent question. I believe that though the current disruption is significant, it is likely to be more short-lived than earlier historical events. Now, getting to your question, will the switch to renewables become more relevant in a turbulent world? I do not think so. It is true that fossil fuels are inherently volatile because their prices depend on a variety of factors, including geopolitics, shipping routes, OPEC decisions, supply shocks, and so on. However, it is important to acknowledge that renewables are also subject to supply shocks. Solar and wind sources are subject to the variability of the weather and the local reliability of the infrastructure upon which they depend. This includes storage facilities, a more extensive electricity grid, and so on. In short, relying on renewables avoids geopolitics on the one hand, but introduces a greater reliance on domestic circumstances that do not offer the diversified sources that are currently available by relying on multiple sources of oil. In other words, benefits and disadvantages when a nation relies more on renewables than crude oil. And I'm not entirely certain that on balance, the advantages outweigh the disadvantages.
Okay. So, Professor Wright, today it's estimated that oil use per unit of global GDP requires roughly 40% of a barrel of oil, compared with a full barrel back in the early 1970s. What do you make of this reduced oil intensity in the global economy? And to what extent do you think this reduced oil intensity has strengthened global economic resilience in the face of the Hormuz crisis?
Yeah, I mean the figures that you've highlighted, I mean they are correct. I mean it's what we've seen is that historically the proportion of a barrel 1 barrel of oil per GDP has actually declined significantly since 1973. You know, it's more than a maybe 55-60% decline. And this has been a trend that we've seen over time taking place. I mean, I think if you were to look at as a rule of thumb, if you would, from the IMF, they would, suggest something like if there's a 30% oil price rise, that would have about 0.5% impact on GDP, and also, can result to about a percentage point of global inflation. But it is definitely smaller than what it was in the 1970s, and this does, tell us that the impact of oil in the global economy is actually becoming less significant when it comes to GDP rates. But although that's the case, this doesn't necessarily mean that it's becoming less of an important variable in terms of economic shocks. I mean, what we've seen is that whilst oil is less of a proportion of it, it is actually becoming much more of a, how can I put it, a commodity whereby it's more integral in key areas. So, for example, it's highly embedded when it comes to emerging markets where they haven't been able to actually move away from this. Also in the petrochemical sectors as well, they're very exposed to the nature of oil and how it actually is being traded. And more broadly, of course, it's not just an oil shock that we're talking about, as I mentioned at the beginning. This is an LNG shock. It's also a commodity shock in a variety of variables. But what I would say is, though, that, although we've seen efficiency savings being made over the last 50 years, the core point is that I think what the role of oil in the global economy is becoming is it remains irreplaceable in function. It still has an integral role when petrochemical feedstocks, aviation fuels, agricultural inputs. So we've seen a very important role of renewables coming in for electricity generation, and that's really important. But the role of oil, it still remains integral, even though as a proportion of GDP, it's of less importance now.
Laury, what do you make of the differences in terms of how different countries or economies absorb the turbulence at the Strait of Hormuz? Some say a major fault line in the world nowadays is not between oil exporting and oil importing economies, but rather between countries whose energy systems leave them exposed to risks or disruptions and countries that began building energy resilience long before the Hormuz crisis arrived. Do you agree with this particular point?
So basically, it does say the same. Look, the producers, they do have a sensitivity to, for instance, in this current crisis, we've seen that the producers have been taken hostage of the choke point, and therefore they were most of the GCC countries, they were unable to export. So they were, and this is a main source of revenue for them. So when you talk about Iraq, you see that Iraq had been really in a difficult position. And if this crisis would last, there will be some social unrest, or because like they do rely on the revenues from the oil. And then when you tell them that you cannot export your oil, then there is a problem. So that's from one side of the producers' problem. The importers, to talk about importers and what they can do and the system resilience of their systems. Again, we're talking about, I guess, two different things when we talk about the oil supply and when we talk about the gas supply. Because today as well, as Stephen has mentioned, we have the gas supply. And if we want to simplify it to people and say that, okay, now there has this kind of switch and gas has been used more into electricity, let's say, generation. So therefore, whoever doesn't have a resilient system to produce electricity and relies only on gas, there's a problem. But those who were able to switch from gas to coal again, they are doing, or those who are like doing more renewables and they can increase it now, they would want to increase it to absorb the shock. But again, on the oil side, is it like, again, are we talking about oil and the byproduct? So therefore, if you have it's the byproduct that we're talking more than the crude oil. And we've seen this problem, for instance, in Europe. We're talking about, okay, we do have a gasoline crisis. And then it was like, no, it's not a gasoline crisis. It's more jet fuel crisis. It's the kerosene crisis. So it's a byproduct crisis. So what do you do on that case? Okay, gasoline. So do you switch to EVs? It's a policy that countries need to take to switch to EVs to be less affected by the by shocks like we are seeing. What to do about jet fuel? Are we quickly switching to more synthetic or other stuff that don't rely on oil and the byproducts of oil? So we're still kind of like in a way that this switching and becoming more resilient, it is taking more time. Don't forget that we're still at a world that uses and consumes up to 1 of 5 million barrels of per day. It's not that we're not that reliant on oil. So that's a big number. And before all this crisis in the Gulf, the other battle that we were witnessing was between the IEA, the International Energy Agency, and OPEC, the oil producing, exporting countries, who were debating or fighting over numbers about the future of oil. And IEA was saying, like, look, we are seeing a world where there is a decline in demand for oil and gas. And mainly the story is the story of China, because China is increasing EV, China is increasing in renewables, all of that stuff that will and making it more resilient as the systems So therefore, we will see a decline in demand. OPEC was saying, but there are other emerging economies that still rely on oil to become more like for their growth, and it's not like the Europeans or kind of decoupling their economies from oil consumption, all of that. Therefore, I think like resilience is very important. Each country, according to their possibilities, need to think about how their systems are more resilient to the international shocks. But at the same time, we cannot say that you need to go back to protectionism and closing your doors to the outside world. It's more this interdependence between countries is very important for different reasons, but it comes at risks as well. So it is it's a challenge for countries and policymakers to be able to protect their citizens and their systems, but at the same time to keep that interdependence or the connectivity with the global economy as well.
Dr. Tombazos, in the face of the Hormuz shock, Spain, Brazil, and China are seen by some as the relatively more resilient economies because of their forward-looking investments into renewables. In the case of Brazil, for example, the country has extensive biofuel infrastructure, so gasoline prices in Brazil rose by just 5% in March, compared with roughly 30% in the United States. What is your personal observation?
The example that you mentioned is quite revealing. Countries like Spain, Brazil, and China illustrate different models of how forward-looking energy investment translates into real insulation from shocks. Brazil is the clearest case of direct substitution. It did not just invest in renewables. It built a functional alternative to oil in the transport sector. Brazil has large-scale ethanol production from sugarcane, widespread use of flex fuel vehicles, and a well-developed distribution network. This means that when oil prices rise, consumers can switch from gasoline to ethanol almost immediately. As a result, demand for gasoline drops and price increases are contained. Brazil has a built-in shock absorber that most countries simply do not have. Spain is a very different case and represents a different type of resilience based mainly on electricity. It has a high share of wind and solar power, a strong integration with Europe, grid integration that is, and reduced reliance on imported fossil fuels for electricity generation. However, transport in Spain still depends heavily on oil, so its resilience is meaningful, but it is not, of course, complete. China's approach is based on scale and diversification. It has invested massively in renewable energy and is rapidly electrifying sectors such as transport. It also has strong control over its energy infrastructure and supply chains. This allowed China to reduce marginal dependence on imported oil. That said, China still imports large quantities of oil, so its resilience is again relative rather than absolute. What ties all these cases together is that they did not simply add renewables to their energy mix. They integrated them into how their economies actually function. That includes infrastructure, end-use substitution, and consistent long-term policy. The contrast with the United States is quite instructive. The United States is a major oil producer, but its transport system remains heavily dependent on gasoline with limited short-term substitutes. So when global oil prices rise, consumers still feel the impact quite strongly. The issue is not lack of supply, but lack of flexibility at the point of consumption. The deeper takeaway is that resilience is not about having energy resources. It is about having options. Or rather, to put it a bit better, the biggest gains in resilience come when alternatives are immediately usable in practice, not just available in theory.
Thank you very much. Let's take a very short break here, and coming back, our discussion will continue. Stay tuned. You're back with World Today. I'm Ding Heng in Beijing. Today we're talking about whether the Hormuz crisis is accelerating global shift to renewable energy. Joining our discussion, Professor Steven Wright, Director of the Leadership Knowledgebase at the Qatar Leadership Centre, Professor Laury Haytayan, Middle East and North Africa Director with Natural Resource Governance Institute, and Dr. Christis Tombazos, Associate Professor of Economics at Monash University. Professor Wright, going back to you, in many ways, the outbreak of the war in Ukraine in 2022 compelled Europe to reduce its reliance on natural gas. Now, because Asian economies are the hardest hit by the ongoing Hormuz shock, would you describe the Iran war as Asia's Ukraine moment? I mean, is the Hormuz shock pushing Asian economies to cut their oil dependencies?
Yeah, I think for Asia in general, as you said quite rightly, it is feeling the impact of this crisis the strongest than anywhere other region in the world. I think it's very real what people are feeling in terms of price hikes, in terms of petroleum, electricity costs cutting, and also how that's also affecting access to other commodities in general. So yes, it is a major geopolitical crisis that is affecting East Asia, and I think actually the analogy that you brought for it is actually very useful, because what we can see is that it almost exposes the differences that would exist between Europe and Asia in terms of how it was actually handled, or actually how it's going to be, how it is being handled. So in Europe's case, Europe was reliant on gas and its energy needs primarily from Russia and Norway. But also Europe has a unified coordination mechanism. So the way in which it dealt with the crisis, it was quite coordinated. But in Asia, we have a very much more diversity of interests and structures that exist. You know, whether it's ASEAN at the political level, or if it's the type of energy security that each countries have. I mean, if I think of, say, Japan, I mean, what you saw is that, you know, Japan now can be expected to accelerate its nuclear restarting simply because of the shock that it has from its the lack of LNG. But also, you know, I think, you know, you're seeing similar issues in South Korea as well, where it's very heavily weighted on the nuclear sector, but also on LNG. So that is you're likely to see a different approach in this. But when you're looking, say, at China, of course, China had a very effective strategic petroleum reserves, and I think that has also helped in terms of managing this crisis, but also the diversification that it has had from importing energy from Russia, and also its domestic renewable sector, which also has helped insulate it. And I think that speaks to a larger story of how a diversified range of energy sources, particularly for electricity generation, can help insulate and provide energy security for a country. But overall, I think, you know, the crisis that actually exists, to come back to the question, yes, it is a major moment in world history because of the range of commodities that have been affected. It's not just oil and gas, and for that reason, I think, you know, it is a crisis which Asia has to navigate, and which the governments are doing.
Laury, according to a recent analysis by Center for Research on Energy and Clean Air, that's a Helsinki-based think tank, global power generation from fossil fuels actually fell in the first months since the start of the Hormuz closure. Large increases in solar and wind power offsets the decline in terms of the gas-fired generation. In particular, it's been found that coal-fired power generation has remained flat, contradicting earlier expectations that coal power generation might rise in response to the Hormuz crisis. What do you make of the trend that this finding is pointing to?
Again, that's a valid. These are valid information to look at and to see if this is a trend or it's because of the current crisis, and if it's not going to continue in that kind of. It's a good direction, right? The report shows you a positive direction, but is it lasting? Or is it just because of the crisis? Again, like when we had COVID, the demand had dropped and therefore CO2 emission dropped, but that was like because there was a big crisis and it was not the trend and the direction of the economies and something that would have lasted. First, I think like it is important to continue like looking at these issues to understand the trend and the trajectory. But to say that in the early months, like when the war started, end of February, and then during March, basically there was this sense of panic, but at the same time, supply was there. Like the panic was happening if the war will last longer than 4 weeks that President Trump had suggested at that time, because already all the shipments from oil, gas, whoever needed it was already either on its way or already arrived to destination. So there was supply. It wasn't a supply issue. The issue was like what happens after the month of March, in April and going forward, if this supply shock continues, especially for the Asian markets. So basically, what happens in this situation, like you start thinking about, okay, what comes next? Now I have this supply problem. That is not an immediate problem, but it might become a problem. So therefore, either you start asking people to consume less. And what we've seen automatically, like from Asia, for instance, there were all these suggestions and instructions from governments to ask people to work from home, for instance. And this is something that we had inherited from the COVID days. Even in Europe, they were like, you know what, we might face a jet fuel problem. So if you don't need to travel, don't take the plane. Try to cut on demand so that we could navigate these problems. So basically, we went into adding additional supply into the market through the SPRs, to the Strategic Petroleum Reserves releases. At the same time, we asked people to consume less. So these were like the two major instructions or policies, the directions that were taken. To say that fossil fuel power generation was cut because of a supply shock, that doesn't say much about the future trend, and that this is a good thing that is happening for those who are more for green energy. To say that switching to wind and solar, again, that's if the system is already put in place, and this is not like something that, if I don't have the system, I cannot like switch from fossil fuel to wind and solar. So the system, they should be integrated into the system already to be able to switch that quickly. For the coal, that's a good news, because coal, basically, it's what you go to when you have an energy crisis and prices are high. This is like the place where, okay, coal is cheaper, so we switch to it. And then that's a bad news for us, of course, those who are like more into wanting more green energies to come into the systems. So if the March outcome and results continue, that's a great thing. But let's see as well for April and May, if yes, many utilities or many countries haven't switched to coal, because we've started hearing about many of the Asian countries switching to coal as one way of protecting consumers and their citizens from high prices, because the crisis is continuing.
Dr. Tombazos, like Laury has suggested earlier, in the past, the oil crisis typically triggered a rush to coal as a cheaper energy alternative. Do you think that scenario is already representing a thing of the past? Why or why not?
That's an excellent question. A rush to coal, I would argue, is not entirely a thing of the past. but it is increasingly becoming less likely than in the past. In early oil crisis, coal was abundant, it was cheap, and it was scalable. Power systems were built around fossil fuels, and there were very few viable alternatives, certainly very few in terms of renewable resources. So in those instances, switching to coal was the easiest and a very natural fallback. But this pattern is weakening. Today, several structural changes are breaking that link. Renewables are now cheaper in many cases. Many countries have retired or capped coal capacity. And there's, of course, climate policies and regulations that discourage coal use. And in addition, electricity systems increasingly prioritize low-cost renewables first. So when fossil supply is disrupted, systems often turn to existing solar and wind rather than coal. But this coal fallback has not disappeared entirely. Some countries, especially parts of Asia, still rely heavily on coal. And in severe or prolonged crisis, governments may still temporarily increase coal use. So the option still exists. It's just weaker than before. We are in a transition period, a transition phase, where in some systems coal is already sidelined, and in others it remains a fallback. The key difference from the past is this: coal is no longer the only, or even, I would say, the most attractive backup option.
Okay. So, Professor Wright, while renewable energy is now commonly perceived as an energy security tool, do you think policymakers in the short run are faced with pressures to subsidize fossil fuels at the pump in some producing countries or economies if the Hormuz crisis continue to drag on?
Thank you. It's a good question. Yeah, I think the pattern I think is definitely visible. We can see it. I mean, there is the IEA, the International Energy Agency, it's calculated in the region of $620 billion a year are being used in subsidies for fossil fuels. And, that's, just under 10 times the amount that's being used for renewables. But basically, there is. It's important. It's good that you've highlighted the question because it's essentially it's a political question within resource-rich countries, which are exporting oil and other natural resources such as Saudi Arabia, Venezuela, Algeria, and so forth, Nigeria. The key issue is that fossil fuels there are heavily subsidized, and what you're seeing is that because of the challenge of what could lead to political or social concern by a rapid rise for those individuals, the governments are stepping in and actually providing subsidies to actually lower that. But that, unfortunately, is quite unhelpful when we think about the need to move towards a more diversified range of energy sources, especially for electricity. What it means is that there'll be less finance available to actually go into those areas. And I think for the, when you look at the IMF, I mean, they highlight that subsidies, that those type of subsidies, if they were phased out, they would reduce global CO2 emissions quite significantly because it can allow us to move into different areas. So overall, what we're seeing is that the net effect of this prolongs the life cycle of fossil fuels and can restrict against the further adoption of renewables. But I think also there is one important aspect to this, which is also taking place. There is also an effect on the global economy more broadly, because previously what was happening is the subsidies that were done historically were being recycled into through petrodollar cycle. What that means is that the higher revenues that exporting countries were receiving, they were then stocking those into US treasuries and European debt. But I think this has now changed, especially since the Russian central bank reserves were taken in 2022 by the EU. And what we've seen then is that now many countries are actually putting those extra petrodollars, they're putting them into more harder commodities such as gold. So what that means is that there's less of a finance becoming available into the US economy in particular, which I think it does have an impact that wasn't there in say 1973 or 1979. So it means that the borrowing costs for countries which are doing this, the fossil fuel exporting countries, the energy exporting countries, won't have as much available finance to actually invest into renewables because they're putting it into these type of commodities. And why that's a factor is because if there isn't a increased purchase of US treasuries, it will lead to higher interest rates because of the cost of actually raising debt. So it also has a knock-on effect. So there is a broader challenge that's being faced from this, but you're right to raise it. Thank you.
Okay. So, Laury, I guess for oil and gas companies, rising energy prices triggered by the Hormuz shock may be a window of opportunity for them to earn some windfall profits. What kind of mechanism do you think should be put in place to convert energy corporations' additional windfall profits into structural investment into renewable energy sources?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that question. So I guess what to say, first, to distinguish between the international oil companies and national oil companies. International oil companies, I guess, and depending on each of these companies and their strategies about are there still the typical company that produces and oil and byproducts, or it's expanding more into becoming a more integrated companies, like we've seen in the latest couple of years ago when it started, many major companies becoming more of integrated, it's not only oil is not only their business, but going more into renewables as well. So I guess it depends on each company's policies on where they want to put that windfall. Is it more on to continue expanding on oil, or if they are an integrated company, if that dollar that they're making, extra dollar, do they want to make it expanding their renewable portfolio if they do have it? But at the same time, for the national oil companies, it's a complete different story because, as you know, national oil companies, these are the companies that do make money. They're supposed to make them money and being like this company that generates money for the government, to give for the government, for the government spending, etc. So there is this kind of deeper relations than IOCs and their relation to governments. So basically, the national oil companies, again, depending on is it only an oil company or more integrated. And then definitely the windfall, where the extra money, where to spend it, it is based on basically on what strategy the government and the NOCs have. It doesn't come as what I'm trying to say is that these are all planned strategies in advance. It's not okay, suddenly now we have a windfall, what to do with it. It is definitely more of it should be planned. And I'd like here as well a bit of promotion where I work at the Natural Resource Governance Institute. We had produced a paper, which is a very interesting paper about NOC transformations, where we do have guides for NOCs and governments about how to do their transformation. And there are 5 steps basically that start with the idea of setting national level policy goals. So it's always important to know the strategy and the goals so that you would know where that extra money is going to be put, either in oil or in renewables, or in advancing national agendas, clean national agenda of the government. So basically, first step is, of course, national goals. The second step, of course, is to assess transition risks and new business opportunities. So for this NOC, what are the new business opportunities and what are the risks at stake? And then the third step is defining the strategic direction and business focus. The fourth step is proposing the institutional setup and ensuring strong governance. And the fifth step, ensuring a just transition and responsible exit, if that's what they want, to exit from that being only oil and gas to something else.
Dr. Tombazos, apart from fossil fuel, do you think the Strait of Hormuz is playing any role in the renewable energy supply chains? For example, at the very beginning of our discussion today, Professor Wright mentioned sulfur, and I guess that's a very important input in the manufacturing of some renewable energy materials. And it is reported that the Middle East accounts for about 24% of global sulfur production and some 50% of global seaborne sulfur trade. So, with that in mind, do you think there is actually a risk that the Hormuz shock might make our global shift to low carbon energy more costly?
Well, there is a risk, though I would think that it's an indirect risk and likely manageable rather than system breaking. It is true, Hormuz matters for a lot more than just oil. The strait is not just an old choke point. It also carries sulfur and petrochemical feedstocks, as well as other industrial inputs. As you also noted, sulfur is important for processing silicon wafers, which are used in the manufacturing of solar panels, as well as extracting and refining nickel and cobalt, which are used in a lot of renewable infrastructure. So disruptions can ripple into clean energy supply chains. How this would raise cost is fairly straightforward. There is a supply disruption. Then there are, of course, higher sulfur and input prices. Higher input costs imply more expensive manufacturing, and more expensive manufacturing implies higher cost for solar panels, for batteries, for wind components, and so on. So the transition could become more expensive on the margin, especially in the short run. But I think that this impact is likely to be limited. Inputs are diversified. Sulfur and related materials are produced in multiple regions around the world. Supply chains can adjust over time. So this is the first reason. The second is that these components represent fundamentally a small share of total costs. They are only one component of total renewable costs. Technology and scale still dominate overall pricing. And the third reason is that learning curves still work. Renewables continue to get cheaper due to innovation and scale. And a temporary input shock does not reverse that long-term trend.
Okay. Professor Wright, some say a challenge for renewables is that they are often hailed as the solution to an immediate crisis, but when that crisis passes, they somehow will become sidelined. Would you agree with this point, and what can be done to address this challenge?
Yeah, I think ultimately speaking, I think what we see is that the historical pattern shows us that in, say, 1986, when the oil price collapsed, and that took out the 1973 renewables programs. And so it's really about a price equilibrium that ultimately speaking, when prices are high when it comes to oil and natural gas, that then leads to investment in R&D and also infrastructural development with regard to renewables in general. I think what we're seeing is, or what the Hormuz, what the current crisis is that it doesn't necessarily, it depends on how long it goes on for, in terms of whether that will be translated into a much more longer term move towards renewables. I mean, what we can look at is that there are different mitigations that can be put into place. There's the when we're looking at renewable investment, it really does need to be tied to an industrial strategy. It isn't really just about a climate change narrative, really, that's going to make countries put the long-term investments in that will actually lead to a lasting change for what the energy mix will actually be within their countries. And that is evidenced by looking at what's happened historically, where we've seen different phases of move towards renewables, but ultimately speaking, funding gets cut, commitment gets waived, because ultimately speaking, what people are motivated by largely is the cheapest energy possible. The world does need more energy in all areas. And I think when we look at the renewables that have been adopted, it's really part of an energy addition. It isn't really an energy transition as such, because ultimately speaking, all forms of energy are increasing in volume. But of course, the shift, the role of renewables in terms of electricity generation is much stronger, and which is a very good thing. But ultimately speaking, I think the Hormuz crisis in terms of and the war that's existing within the Gulf region, it's a window and a crossroads, and it really depends on how long this actually lasts, and that will then determine the nature of how countries respond, whether it's just going to be short-term efforts of looking for different forms of energy to meet their immediate needs, or they're going to start putting in long-term industrial strategies to actually, move in the direction of greater renewable adoption more broadly.
Okay. So, Laury, the final question goes to you. Do you see any potential that the Strait of Hormuz crisis might fundamentally change our existing energy system dynamics?
Look, the immediate reaction to the crisis that we are seeing for the GCC, let me speak, because they are as well the most affected, because suddenly they've seen their most precious commodity being cut from the global economies. To think about rerouting, if you want to say, like to find new routes to bypass the Hormuz. So that's the first reaction that we're seeing, that there might be investment into a big infrastructure projects, which are like either pipelines bypassing Hormuz or other big projects to bypass Hormuz and go from the Red Sea to the Mediterranean or to other routes, and more collaboration between the countries to link their infrastructure, oil and gas infrastructure. So this is the first, if you see that reaction that we're seeing from the Strait of Hormuz. Definitely there would be other reactions from other countries based on what their capacities are. So they would want to be more protecting their systems, so go into more investment in renewables. And we might see like other countries that they have been fighting with FIDs for their oil, gas projects, for instance, or there might get attention, and there might be an increase in investment in new oil, gas projects. So these are like, I think, trends that we are currently monitoring to see which one of these is going to be most popular with governments, and that hopefully this crisis will be over soon.
Well, a big thank you to our panelists, Professor Steven Wright from the Qatar Leadership Centre, Professor Laury Haytayan from Natural Resource Governance Institute, as well as Dr. Christis Tombazos joining us from Monash University. That's all the time for this edition of the program. I'm Ding Heng in Beijing. Thank you so much for listening. Bye for now.